The amber liquid, a 50-year-old single malt scotch worth more than her entire semester's tuition, arced through the air in a slow, horrifying ballet. It landed not on the polished mahogany table, but on the pristine lapel of the guest's custom-tailored suit. The stain spread like a dark sin. Silence fell upon the private dining room, a sudden, suffocating vacuum high above the glittering lights of Manhattan. The man, a brutish titan of industry with a face hardened by greed, turned slowly. His eyes, small and cruel, fixed on her. Before Chloe could stammer an apology, his hand shot out, clamping around her arm like a steel trap. His voice, a low growl of entitlement, slithered through the quiet. "You'll work this off," he snarled, his grip tightening, "right here, on your knees." Her world was about to shatter, but not in the way she expected. The man who watched from the shadows would change everything. And if you stay with us until the end, you will discover the devastating secret that connected them long before this night. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Chloe was 22, a literature student by day and a ghost by night, floating between tables in a uniform that felt more like a costume. She served men who could buy and sell her future on a whim, all to pay for a degree that promised an escape she was beginning to doubt. Her life was a quiet study in resilience, a series of small, dignified gestures in the face of overwhelming pressure. She lived in a tiny apartment that always felt cold, her only companions the books stacked high against the walls, and a persistent loneliness that clung to her like the city's winter chill. She carried herself with a grace that belied the exhaustion in her bones, her face a mask of polite efficiency hiding a fierce, unyielding spirit. The restaurant was a theater of power, its air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged leather, and unspoken threats. The clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of conversations about mergers and acquisitions were the soundtrack to her servitude. Her manager, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes, watched her with a proprietary gaze that made her skin crawl. Every shift was a tightrope walk over a chasm of financial ruin. A broken glass, a forgotten order, a single complaint from a powerful patron, any misstep could send her tumbling. She felt the oppressive weight of this world, the stark, brutal contrast between their casual opulence and her desperate struggle for survival, a disparity that sharpened her sense of justice to a razor's edge. She had learned to see beyond the expensive suits and confident smiles. In the faces of these men, she saw a familiar emptiness, a moral void that reminded her of the men who had ruined her father, leaving her family with nothing but debt and broken pride. This memory was the source of her quiet strength, the fuel for her refusal to be broken. She didn't just see a spilled drink, she saw a symbol of their carelessness, their belief that everything and everyone had a price. It was this silent judgment, this unwavering moral clarity in her eyes that set her apart. She was a mirror in which they could see their own ugliness, and they hated her for it. Her defiance was not loud, but it was absolute. Her evenings were a rhythm of controlled movements, the precise angle of a wine bottle, the soft placement of a silver fork, the forced, gentle smile. The sensory details were etched into her memory. The low ambient hum of the ventilation system, the reflection of chandeliers in a polished spoon, the weight of the heavy service tray pressing into her shoulder. She moved through the opulent space like a phantom, present but unseen, an observer of a world she could never belong to. This gilded cage, with its marble floors and panoramic views, felt more like a prison than any place she had ever known. Each night a reminder of the vast, unbridgeable distance between her life and theirs. But tonight, the air was different. It was charged with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with the deals being made at the tables. From the corner of the room, a man watched. He was unlike the others. He was still, silent, a predator at rest. Dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light, he exuded an aura of absolute authority that required no words. His gaze wasn't lecherous or dismissive. It was analytical, intense, as if he were reading the very contents of her soul. She felt it on her skin like a physical touch, a cold premonition that the fragile balance of her world was about to be irrevocably shattered. A storm was gathering in the quiet of the room. The city exhaled its weary, metallic breath as Chloe descended into the subway's belly, another anonymous soul swallowed by the evening rush. The screech of the train wheels against the tracks was a familiar scream, a sound that mirrored the tension coiled in her own shoulders. She pressed herself into a corner of the crowded car, the press of bodies a strange and suffocating comfort against the profound loneliness that awaited her at home. Her reflection in the grimy window was a pale, tired ghost superimposed over the blur of passing tunnel lights. This daily pilgrimage from the university's world of ideas to the restaurant's world of servitude was a journey between two planets, and she was the exhausted astronaut caught in the void between them, her dreams growing heavier with each stop. Her apartment was a small third-floor sanctuary where the city's noise was muffled to a distant roar. It was clean but sparse, furnished with second-hand pieces and towering stacks of books that threatened to consume the limited space. These were her real treasures, the silent companions that offered escape into worlds of poetry and prose, far from the clatter of plates and the condescending smiles of patrons. A single wilting orchid sat on the windowsill, a gift from her mother, a fragile symbol of the beauty she fought to cultivate in a life defined by pragmatism and sacrifice. The air was always a little too cold, a constant reminder of the bills she struggled to pay and the warmth she desperately missed, a warmth that had vanished the day her father lost everything. The weight she carried was more than just tuition fees. It was the ghost of her father's failed business, a legacy of debt and shame that fell squarely on her shoulders. He had been an honest man, a craftsman swallowed by the predatory tactics of bigger, more ruthless companies. Chloe remembered the hushed, frantic phone calls, the slow dimming of the light in his eyes, and the finality of the foreclosure sign on their front lawn. She had promised him, in the quiet of his defeat, that she would rebuild what they had lost, that his belief in honor and hard work would not die with his dream. This vow was both her anchor and her chain, the reason she endured the nightly humiliations, trading pieces of her spirit for a degree she hoped would one day be her weapon. Her phone buzzed with a call from her mother, her voice a fragile threat connecting Chloe to a past she was trying to outrun. The conversation was a carefully choreographed dance around their shared anxieties. Her mother would ask if she was eating enough, if she was safe, her questions laced with an unspoken fear of failure. Chloe would reply with forced cheerfulness, describing her studies but omitting the bone-deep exhaustion and the manager's wandering hands. Every reassuring word was a small lie, a shield to protect her mother from the harsh reality of her sacrifice. Hanging up, Chloe felt the familiar pang of guilt. She was a pillar of strength for her family, but inside, she felt like she was crumbling to dust, held together only by sheer, stubborn will. The uniform hung in her closet, a shroud of dark, synthetic fabric. Putting it on was a ritual of erasure. It stripped her of her name, her thoughts, her ambitions, and remade her as an extension of the restaurant's brand, polite, efficient, and invisible. The starched collar felt like a restraint, the apron a mark of her station. As she tied the knot behind her back, she would catch her reflection in the mirror and see a stranger, her eyes holding a weary resignation that scared her. This nightly transformation was a necessary death of self, a compartmentalization that allowed the student who debated Tolstoy in the afternoon to become the servant who refilled water glasses without being seen, a ghost haunting the periphery of other people's lavish lives. The restaurant's manager, Mr. Davies, moved with the oily confidence of a man who enjoyed his small kingdom. His power was absolute within these walls, and he wielded it with petty cruelty. He would praise her in one breath and criticize her in the next, keeping her perpetually off balance. His compliments felt more violating than his insults, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long, a silent reminder that her employment was conditional, dependent on his goodwill. She endured his thinly veiled threats and casual degradations with a placid expression, her anger a cold, hard nut in her stomach. He was a microcosm of the world she served, a man who mistook her silence for submission, never realizing it was the calm surface of a raging sea. She observed the patrons with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. They spoke of billion-dollar deals with the same casualness she spoke of her grocery list. They laughed loudly, their confidence born from a lifetime of never being told no. They treated the staff with an indifference that was more cutting than outright cruelty, as if they were part of the decor, functional but inanimate. In their faces, Chloe saw the same entitled emptiness she remembered from the men who had destroyed her father. They were careless with their power, their words, and their money, oblivious to the lives they impacted. Her quiet service was an act of rebellion. She would not let their world corrupt the core of her own. There were small moments of defiance, invisible to everyone but herself. When a wealthy patron berated a young busboy for a minor mistake, Chloe would step in with a calm apology, deflecting the anger onto herself. She would share her tips with the kitchen staff on slow nights, a small gesture of solidarity in a place designed to pit them against each other. These were not grand acts of heroism, but they were hers. They were quiet affirmations of her own moral code, a refusal to become as cold and transactional as the environment she was forced to inhabit. Each act, however small, was a stitch holding her integrity together, a silent promise to herself that she would not break, no matter how much pressure they applied. Tonight, the atmosphere was different, electric, with a more dangerous current. A private party had booked the main dining room, a guest list of the city's most formidable figures. Mr. Davies had been on edge all day, his usual smugness replaced by a nervous energy. He pulled Chloe aside, his voice a low hiss. "This is Julian Croft's party. Do not make a single mistake. These are not people you want to displease." The name meant nothing to her, but the fear in her manager's eyes was a language she understood perfectly. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she picked up her tray, the weight of the crystal glasses feeling heavier than usual, each one a potential disaster waiting to happen. She moved through the room, her senses on high alert, the low murmur of powerful men a constant hum beneath the soft jazz. Her hands were steady, her movements fluid, a practiced dance of professional deference. It was as she approached a table near the window, a man with a brutish, florid face laughing at his own joke, that her foot caught on the edge of the thick carpet. For a horrifying, silent second, she was suspended in time, the tray tilting in her hands. The amber liquid, a 50-year-old single malt scotch worth more than her entire semester's tuition, arced through the air in a slow, horrifying ballet. It landed not on the polished mahogany table, but on the pristine lapel of the guest's custom-tailored suit. Silence fell, absolute and suffocating. The man's face contorted with rage, and his hand shot out, clamping around her arm like a steel trap. "You'll work this off," he snarled, his grip tightening, "right here, on your knees." Before fear could fully paralyze her, a voice cut through the room. It was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very crystal of the chandeliers. It was a sound as cold and clean as polished steel, and with it, the room's thick, angry tension shattered into a million silent pieces. The brute's grip on her arm loosened, his snarling face suddenly slack with a confusion that quickly morphed into primal fear. Every head in the room turned, not toward Chloe, but toward the source of that voice, a man seated in the far corner, a figure who had, until this moment, been nothing more than a shadow against the city lights. He had not moved, yet he now commanded the entire space. There, in a high-backed leather chair, sat Julian Croft. His name was a currency of fear and respect, traded in whispers from Wall Street to the darkest corners of the city's underworld. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to drink the low light, making him a void in the opulent room. His stillness was his power. While other men postured and boasted, he simply existed, his presence a gravitational force that bent the world around him. Two men, identically dressed and impassive as stone, stood discreetly behind him, their existence a quiet testament to the danger he embodied. The air around his table was different, colder, thinner, a pocket of lethal calm in the center of a storm. He was a king in his court, and everyone present was an unwilling subject. He did not speak again. He simply lifted his hand from the arm of his chair, a slow, deliberate gesture that held more power than a shouted order. The man holding Chloe's arm flinched as if struck, his face draining of its florid color. He released her instantly, stepping back with a deference that bordered on terror. Julian's hand remained suspended for a moment, a silent, unassailable verdict. The entire room held its breath, caught in the tableau he had orchestrated. He was a conductor of violence and silence, and with a single, effortless motion, he had rewritten the end of this humiliating scene. He had asserted his dominance not through force, but through the chilling certainty that he could unleash it at will, a promise more terrifying than any overt threat. Then his gaze moved. It bypassed the now cowering brute, dismissing him as utterly insignificant, and settled on Chloe. His eyes were a deep, unreadable gray, like a winter storm over the ocean. They held no warmth, no pity, only a piercing, analytical intensity that felt more invasive than any physical touch. She felt seen, truly seen for the first time all night, not as a waitress, not as a function, but as a person. It was a terrifying sensation. He was not looking at her body or her uniform. He was looking directly into her, searching for something in the depths of her soul. She could not look away, trapped by a force that was equal parts fear and a strange magnetic pull she could not begin to comprehend. From Julian's perspective, the world was populated by the weak and the greedy, their motives transparent, their fears easily manipulated. He had expected to see the usual panicked submission in the girl's eyes, the familiar look of a mouse cornered by a cat. But he did not. Beneath the surface of her fear, he saw a flicker of something else, something he had not encountered in years, an unyielding, defiant pride. It was not aggressive, but a quiet, solid core of integrity that refused to be broken. It was in the straightness of her spine, the steady set of her jaw, the way her eyes, though wide, held his gaze without apology. In her silent defiance, he saw a ghost of an honor his world had long ago taught him to discard as a liability. A muscle ticked in his jaw, the only sign of the internal disturbance her gaze had caused. He saw the faint tremble in her hands, yet her spirit remained unbent. This girl, with her cheap uniform and her student's debt, possessed a strength that the powerful men around him could never buy. She was a relic from a different world, a world where dignity was not a commodity. The sight of it unsettled him, touching a long dormant part of himself he kept buried beneath layers of violence and control. He saw his own reflection in her, not as he was, but as he might have been before the darkness claimed him. It was a disquieting and profoundly lonely realization, a crack in the armor he so carefully maintained. With a final, lingering glance that felt like a brand on her skin, Julian gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the brute. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, but of dismissal. The command was absolute. The man, sweating now, mumbled a clumsy apology that was lost in the suffocating silence and practically fled the room, his entourage scrambling in his wake. Julian had not uttered a single word to him, yet he had dismantled the man's power and pride with nothing more than a look and a gesture. The other guests turned back to their tables, their conversations resuming in hushed, nervous tones. The immediate danger had passed, but Chloe knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had just stepped from a simple fire into a raging inferno. Now, only the ghost of the confrontation remained, leaving Chloe and Julian as the two poles of the room's energy. His eyes were still on her, And in the quiet aftermath, the intensity of his gaze felt less like an interrogation and more like a recognition. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now intertwined with a bewildering sense of connection. For a fleeting second, the cold mask of the crime lord slipped, and she saw a flicker of profound weariness in his eyes, a loneliness so deep it seemed to absorb all the light in the room. In that silent, shared moment, she felt that he was not just seeing her, but that he was also allowing himself to be seen, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. He was the one who broke the spell. Julian rose from his chair in one fluid, economical motion, his powerful frame unfolding with a predator's grace. He smoothed the front of his jacket, a simple, mundane act that seemed imbued with immense significance. He gave her one last look, a look that was both a warning and something else she could not name, then turned and walked toward the exit. His security detail materialized from the shadows and fell into step behind him, their presence as silent and ominous as his own. As he passed her table, she caught the faint, clean scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something cold like winter air, a scent that would haunt her long after he was gone. The room seemed to grow warmer, brighter, as the door closed behind him. Chloe stood frozen, her hand instinctively going to the arm the other man had grabbed. But it wasn't the brute's painful grip she felt. It was the echo of Julian Croft's gaze, a phantom touch that lingered on her skin. The spilled drink, the threat, the humiliation, it all faded into the background, rendered insignificant by the man who had intervened. He had saved her from one predator, only to mark her as something of interest to another, far more dangerous one. She did not know his name, but she knew, with the certainty of a changing season, that her life had been irrevocably altered. The silence he left behind was louder than any noise, a ringing void that held the terrifying promise of his return. Days turned into a week, and the memory of that night became a ghost that walked beside her through the university's quiet libraries and crowded lecture halls. Chloe tried to bury the image of Julian Croft's eyes in textbooks and essays, but his gaze was an indelible ink stain on her thoughts. She felt a disquieting shift in the fabric of her reality, a subtle hum of awareness that had not been there before. The city no longer felt anonymous, it felt like a stage, and she was unnervingly conscious of an unseen audience. She told herself it was paranoia, a lingering trauma from the confrontation, but a deeper instinct whispered that the silence he left behind was not an ending, but a prelude, an unnerving and patient pause before the music began to play again. Her world, once defined by its predictable, grinding rhythm, now held a new latent tension. She would catch the reflection of a dark town car in a shop window, and her heart would leap into her throat. A man in a dark suit walking down the opposite side of the street would make her quicken her pace. The fear was constant, a low-grade fever that colored her days. Yet, beneath the fear was something else, something she was ashamed to admit even to herself, a flicker of intense, dangerous curiosity. He had seen her, not just her uniform or her mistake, but the unyielding core of her being. In a life of being overlooked, that potent, terrifying act of recognition was as magnetic as it was menacing. She was both running from him and searching for him in every shadow. The first time she saw him again, it was not a coincidence. She was leaving the campus library late one evening, the cool night air a welcome relief against her flushed skin. A black sedan was idling across the street, its engine a low, predatory purr in the quiet of the academic quad. He was in the back seat, the window down just enough for her to see his silhouette against the ambient city glow. He wasn't looking at her, but straight ahead, as if lost in thought. Yet she knew, with absolute certainty, that his presence was for her. He was a silent sentinel, a figure of immense power occupying her humble world. She froze for a moment, then forced herself to walk on, the feeling of his unseen gaze a physical weight on her back. He began to appear in the periphery of her life, a ghost in the architecture of his own power. He would be at a corner table in a cafe where she stopped for coffee, his attention seemingly on a newspaper, but his stillness a palpable force. She saw him once through the window of a private club as her bus passed, a motionless figure in a room of animated, powerful men. These were not encounters, they were statements. He was showing her the reach of his world and the ease with which he could intersect hers, all without a single word. Each sighting tightened an invisible thread between them, pulling her deeper into an orbit she desperately wanted to escape, but was increasingly powerless to resist. Chloe's fear began to war with a growing sense of fascination. She started to observe him back, stealing furtive glances when she knew he was near. She saw the profound loneliness in his isolation, the way he held himself apart even when surrounded by his own men. She noticed the weariness that sometimes settled in his features when he thought no one was watching. The fearsome mob boss, the myth whispered in the city's dark corners, began to resolve into something far more complicated and human, a man imprisoned by the very power he commanded. This glimpse of the man behind the mask did not lessen her fear, but it deepened it, twisting it into a complex knot of empathy and dread she could not untangle. He was drawn to the simple, unwavering rhythm of her life. From the sterile quiet of his armored car, Julian watched her navigate a world he had long forgotten. He saw her arguing with a professor, her face alive with intellectual passion. He saw her share her sandwich with a homeless man, a gesture of casual kindness that felt like a foreign language to him. Her existence was a quiet rebuke to his own, a life built on integrity and empathy rather than fear and dominance. She was a mirror reflecting a path he had not taken, and the image it showed him was both a torment and a strange, unfamiliar comfort. He found himself needing to see her, to witness this small, bright flame of decency in his world of shadows. One afternoon, a package arrived at her small apartment. It was a slender, rectangular box wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a first edition copy of The Master and Margarita, a book she had passionately defended in a literary theory seminar just days before. There was no note, there was no name. There was only the book, its worn cover a testament to its history. The gesture was a violation, a clear signal that he could not only see her, but could also hear her, that the walls of her life were transparent to him. The gift was not a kindness, it was a demonstration of his omnipotence, a velvet glove on an iron fist. She felt a cold wave of anger wash over her. This was not a courtship, it was a siege. She would not be a curiosity for a powerful man to collect. The next day, she took the subway to a part of town she had only ever read about, the book clutched in her hand like a weapon. She found the formidable steel and glass skyscraper that housed his legitimate business enterprises, and, with a courage she did not know she possessed, walked into the lobby. She asked the unimpressed receptionist to deliver the packet to Mr. Croft. She did not leave her name. The message was clear. She was not for sale. She was not a prize. She was returning his move, placing the piece back on his side of the board. Her act of defiance did not go unnoticed. 2 days later, Mr. Davies, her manager at the restaurant, was fired. There was no explanation, only hushed rumors among the staff. A new manager, a professional and distant woman, took his place. The oppressive atmosphere Chloe had endured every night vanished. The change was a relief, but it was a poisoned one. Julian had removed an obstacle from her path, a petty tyrant from her life, but he had done so without her consent. His protection felt like a form of control, a silken cage slowly being built around her. He was showing her what his power could do for her, and the terrifying implication, what it could do to her if she ever truly displeased him. That evening, as she left work, he was waiting for her. Not in his car, but standing under the awning of the building next door, the rain casting shimmering patterns on the pavement around him. He held a black umbrella. He did not approach her, but simply watched her emerge. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was different. This was direct. She could run, but she knew it would be pointless. She walked toward him, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. "You shouldn't have come to my office," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the sound of the rain. It was not a question, nor was it an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "You shouldn't have sent the book," she countered, her own voice steadier than she expected. She stopped a few feet from him, just outside the protection of his umbrella, letting the cool rain fall on her face. His gray eyes searched hers, and for a moment, the immense power and control seemed to fall away, replaced by a raw, unguarded intensity. He saw her defiance, her fear, and the unshakable moral certainty that anchored her. He was a problem, Julian stated, his gaze flicking for a second toward the restaurant. I solved it. It was the logic of his world, simple and brutal. "It wasn't your problem to solve," she replied, her words a quiet challenge to his entire existence. He took a step closer, bringing her under the circle of his umbrella. The sudden absence of rain on her skin was startling, as was his proximity. She could smell the cold night air on his wool coat, the faint scent of sandalwood. "In my world, Chloe," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, "everything I see becomes my problem." The use of her name, the first time he had ever spoken it, was both intimate and chilling. It was a claim. He was no longer a distant observer. He had crossed a line, stepping out of the shadows and directly into her life. The air between them was thick with everything they were not saying, a dangerous magnetic pull that defied logic and morality. The moment was broken by the squeal of tires. A dark sedan, not his, screeched around the corner, its headlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness like daggers. Julian's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The quiet intensity vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. His body became a shield, his hand moving with imperceptible speed to grip her arm, pulling her back and behind him in one fluid protective motion. It was not a gesture of control, but a pure animal instinct to protect. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body, a shocking and undeniable connection forged in a moment of sudden, shared danger. His two men, materializing from the shadows as if summoned by his tension, stepped forward, their hands inside their coats. Julian's eyes were locked on the other car, which had slowed to a crawl. He did not seem to be breathing. In that frozen instant, Chloe understood the true nature of his world. It was not just about wealth and influence. It was a place of sudden, brutal violence, where death could arrive on any street corner. The abstract danger she had feared had become terrifyingly real. The man who had been a source of her fear was now, inexplicably, her only sanctuary from a much greater threat. The other car lingered for a moment, a silent, menacing presence, before accelerating and disappearing into the city's concrete veins. The immediate threat was gone, but the tension remained, clinging to the air like the damp chill of the rain. Julian did not release her arm immediately. He stood for a long moment, his body a rigid wall between her and the world, his gaze still scanning the empty street. She could feel the coiled strength in his grip, the controlled power thrumming just beneath the surface. He had protected her. He had broken his own code of detachment, reacting not as a calculated strategist, but as a man. He finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a new, dark complexity. The silent game of observation was over. The boundaries had been shattered. By stepping in front of her, he had publicly declared her as something under his protection, a dangerous and irrevocable act in his world. He had pulled her from the shore into the deep, turbulent waters he inhabited, and she knew with a sickening certainty that neither of them could ever go back. His protection was not a gift, it was a sentence, binding her to the very darkness she had fought so hard to keep at bay. The rain continued to fall around them, washing the city clean, but Chloe felt as if she had been permanently marked. Julian finally let go of her arm, but the phantom heat of his touch lingered, a brand signifying her entry into his life. He said nothing more, simply gave a sharp nod to one of his men, who stepped forward to escort her to a waiting car. His car. It was no longer a choice. Her world of books and quiet dignity had collided with his universe of silent violence, and the impact had left them both irrevocably altered, standing together in the wreckage. The ride was a journey into a different state of being, a silent passage through the city's glittering veins. The car's interior was a tomb of black leather and polished wood, so insulated from the outside world that the sound of the rain and the city's frantic pulse vanished completely. All that remained was the soft hum of the engine and the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. Chloe sat rigid, staring at her reflection in the rain-streaked window, a pale, ghost-like image against the blur of passing lights. Julian was a statue of stillness beside her, his presence a heavy, palpable weight in the enclosed space. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne mingling with the damp wool of his coat. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the terrifying gravity of what had just happened, a shared secret that now bound them together. They did not drive to her neighborhood. The car ascended, climbing the spiraling ramp of an underground garage before opening into the private lobby of a residential skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The elevator rose with a silent, frictionless speed, opening directly into a penthouse apartment that was less a home and more a monument to power and isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, godlike view of Manhattan, the city lights a sprawling galaxy of diamonds laid at their feet. The space was vast, minimalist, and cold, furnished with dark leather and chrome that reflected the city's glow. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, only the profound emptiness of a life lived at a distance from the world, a gilded cage high above the noise of humanity. Chloe walked to the center of the room, feeling small and utterly out of place. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, clear-headed resolve. She turned to face him, her fear now eclipsed by a desperate need for the truth. This was her transgression, her final act of defiance against the quiet servitude that had defined her life. She would not be a pawn in his silent, dangerous game. "Why?" she asked, her voice a fragile but unbroken thread in the immense quiet of the room. "Why did you do that? What do you want from me?" The questions hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to the unspoken rules of his universe, an insistence on a humanity he had long since learned to suppress. She was demanding a reckoning, and she would not be silenced. He did not answer immediately. Julian walked to the window, his back to her, and for a long moment he simply stared out at the city he owned. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of its usual authority, and filled with a weariness that seemed to come from a place deep within his soul. "When I was 19, he began, his gaze fixed on the distant lights, I watched a man lose everything because he was honorable, because he refused to bend. The world broke him, and I did nothing to stop it." He turned his head slightly, his profile etched against the glass. "You have his eyes," he said, the words a quiet confession. That same damn stubborn pride. In that moment, he was no longer a crime lord. He was a man haunted by a ghost, and she was the living reminder of a debt he could never repay. His phone vibrated on a glass table, a harsh, intrusive sound that shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment. He glanced at the screen, and the mask of cold control snapped back into place. His jaw tightened. The men from the street, the rivals who had challenged him, were not retreating. They had interpreted his act of protecting her as a weakness, a chink in his impenetrable armor. The call was a report. They were making a move, testing his territory, escalating the conflict. The danger that had briefly appeared and vanished in the rain had now followed them here, into this sterile sanctuary. Her presence had not only put her in danger, it had made him a target, pulling them both into the heart of a war he had expertly avoided for years. His first instinct was the one that had kept him alive for 2 decades: cold, swift, and brutal retaliation. He could make a single call, and by morning, the men who had threatened them would cease to be a problem. It was the language of his world, the only logic it understood. But as he reached for the phone, his gaze fell on Chloe. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the unwavering integrity that had drawn him to her in the first place. To unleash his violence now, in front of her, would be to destroy the very thing he was trying to protect. It would be to prove that he was nothing more than the monster she feared. In a decision that went against every rule of his survival, he let the phone ring out, silencing it with a press of his thumb. He walked toward her, his movement slow, deliberate. The battle raging within him was visible in the tense line of his shoulders, in the dark conflict in his eyes. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat from his body, see the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He raised his hand, and she flinched, a small, involuntary reaction. But his touch, when it came, was impossibly gentle. His fingers brushed against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was not a gesture of possession or desire, but of a profound, aching reverence. It was the touch of a man starving, reaching for something pure he knew he could never have, a silent apology for the darkness he had brought into her world. In that single, breathtaking moment of contact, Chloe understood everything. The warmth of his skin against hers was a conduit, and through it flowed the crushing weight of his loneliness, his guilt, and a lifetime of carefully controlled sorrow. She saw the boy he had been, the world had broken him, the man he might have become. The terrifying mob boss, the silent predator, dissolved, and in his place was a man drowning in the prison of his own making. Her fear did not vanish, but it was transformed, deepened by an empathy so powerful it felt like a physical pain in her chest. She saw his soul, and it was a shattered, beautiful, and utterly tragic thing. He saw the change in her eyes. He saw her fear melt into a devastating understanding, her judgment replaced by a compassion he did not deserve. In her gaze, he saw not a victim, but a witness, and it was more than he could bear. He had sought to protect a flicker of light in his world of shadows, only to realize that his very touch was the thing that would extinguish it. The act of saving her was inextricably linked to her ruin. This was his true penance, to find a reason to be a better man, only to understand that he was incapable of being anything other than what he was, a force of destruction. The knowledge settled on him with the weight of a final, unassailable truth. He pulled his hand back as if her skin had burned him. The connection was broken, but the echo of it remained, a shimmering, charged space between them. The air in the penthouse was thick with the weight of unspoken words, of a truth so profound it needed no voice. The city lights outside seemed to dim, the world holding its breath in the aftermath of their collision. He had broken his code, and she had broken hers. They stood in the wreckage, 2 strangers who had seen the deepest parts of each other's souls. Nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that fell was not an ending, but the beginning of a far more dangerous consequence. He did not have to speak. The command was in the sharp, almost imperceptible nod he gave to the man waiting by the door. The moment of raw, fragile connection was severed, cauterized by the cold necessity of his world. Julian took a deliberate step back, the space between them once again a chasm of power and danger. The penthouse, which for a fleeting instant had felt like a confession booth, reverted to being a cage of glass and steel. He turned away from her, his shoulders a rigid line of dismissal, and walked back to the window, presenting her with nothing but his imposing silhouette against the city lights. He was erasing the man she had just seen, burying him beneath the crime lord's impenetrable facade. The message was clear and brutal. Their moment was over, and she was being sent back to a world where she would be safe from him. The journey back to her apartment was a descent into a silent, suffocating abyss. She was placed in a different car, driven by a man whose face she never saw, his presence as impersonal as the tinted glass that separated her from the city. The rain had softened to a fine mist, blurring the vibrant lights of Manhattan into watercolor streaks of red and gold. Chloe stared at her own pale reflection, a ghost haunting the window, her mind replaying the impossible gentleness of his touch against her cheek. The warmth of it still lingered, a phantom sensation that was both a comfort and a torment. He had pulled her into the heart of his storm, shown her the wreckage of his soul, and then cast her out. The silence in the car was absolute, a ringing void that echoed the profound, unspoken truth that had passed between them in his sky-high prison. Julian remained at the window long after the car carrying her had been swallowed by the city's concrete canyons. The silence she left behind was a physical entity, heavier and more profound than any he had ever known. His apartment, once a symbol of his untouchable power and isolation, now felt like a tomb, its vast emptiness mocking him. The city lights, usually a testament to his dominion, now seemed to be millions of tiny, indifferent eyes, all witnesses to his failure. He had found something pure, a flicker of the honor he thought long dead, and his immediate instinctual response was to shield it. But to shield it, he had to push it away, to exile it from his life. He had chosen her safety over his own solace, a sacrifice that left him more alone than ever before, a king reigning over a kingdom of ghosts. Back in her small, third-floor walk-up, the world felt tilted on its axis. The familiar scent of old books and brewing tea could not mask the lingering, phantom scent of his sandalwood cologne. Her sanctuary now felt flimsy, its walls too thin to keep out the memory of his confession or the cold reality of his world. She sat on the edge of her bed, the city's distant hum a poor substitute for the frantic beating of her own heart. The night had stripped away her innocence, replacing it with a heavy, burdensome knowledge. He was not just a monster from the shadows. He was a man defined by a single, tragic choice made long ago. The weight of his guilt had somehow become hers to carry, a shared secret that now connected them across the impossible distance he had imposed. A few days later, the consequences of that night rippled out into the world. A small article, very deep in the business section of the newspaper, caught her eye. It detailed a sudden and violent restructuring within a rival shipping syndicate, mentioning a warehouse fire on the Brooklyn docks and the disappearance of 2 key lieutenants. There were no names, no direct accusations, but Chloe knew. She could feel the cold certainty of it in her bones. This was Julian's response. This was the violence he had held back in her presence, the brutal language of his world. He had not silenced the threat, he had annihilated it. The knowledge made her feel sick, a coiling knot of fear in her stomach. His protection was not a shield, it was a sword, and it had been wielded in her name. The news report was a cruel, clarifying light. Her fear, once a vague and atmospheric dread, now had a specific, bloody shape. The pain of his rejection was eclipsed by a lucid, terrifying understanding. He had not pushed her away out of cruelty, but as an act of profound, if misguided, preservation. He was protecting her not from his enemies, but from himself, from the darkness that was his very essence. In his world, to care for someone was to make them a target. To love them was to sign their death warrant. Her initial anger at his dismissal dissolved into a deep, aching sorrow, not for herself, but for him. She saw the tragic architecture of his life, a fortress built to keep everyone out, but which had also become his inescapable prison. In the weeks that followed, Julian moved through his world like a ghost of his former self. He was colder, more ruthless, his decisions swifter and more final than ever before. He met with his capos in dimly lit rooms that smelled of cigar smoke and fear, his gray eyes revealing nothing of the man who had confessed his soul to a waitress in the rain. He was rebuilding his armor, piece by piece, reinforcing the walls that her quiet dignity had so effortlessly breached. He worked with a relentless, punishing focus, drowning the memory of her in spreadsheets and strategy, in acts of calculated violence and intimidation. It was a penance of his own design. For every moment of humanity he had shown her, he would commit 10 acts of brutality, proving to the world and to himself that the monster was all he was. Time stretched into a long, unbroken silence. The seasons began to turn, the city's autumn chill seeping through the cracks in Chloe's window frame. There were no more dark sedans idling outside her library, no more chance encounters in quiet cafes, no more anonymous gifts. The invisible thread that had connected them was gone, or perhaps it had been stretched so thin it was no longer visible. The void he left was a constant, quiet ache. She would find herself staring out at the skyline, her eyes searching for the tower where he lived, a solitary king in his castle of clouds. The silence between them was no longer a pause, it was a statement, a final, unbreachable distance that felt as absolute as death itself. Yet she was not broken. The experience had not shattered her, it had forged her. Chloe poured the complex storm of her emotions, the fear, the sorrow, the empathy, into her studies. Her essays became sharper, her arguments in class more insightful, imbued with a tragic wisdom that her professors noted with surprise. She no longer saw the world in simple black and white, in heroes and villains. She understood the vast, gray landscape of moral compromise, the weight of choices made in the dark. She carried herself with a new, quiet confidence, her former vulnerability replaced by a resilient, knowing grace. The girl who had spilled a drink had vanished. In her place was a woman who understood the true cost of power and the devastating beauty of a monster's regret. The echo of what had happened, of what had been confessed and what had been left unsaid, settled into a permanent part of her soul. It was a quiet melancholy that colored the edges of her days, a constant awareness of a parallel world moving just alongside her own. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was hushed and the only sound was the ticking of the clock on her wall, she would allow herself to feel the full weight of his absence. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic that he was out there, thinking of her too. They were two solitary figures on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide, forever bound by a single touch, a shared secret, and the deafening silence that now defined them both. A year later, on a sun-drenched afternoon that felt a world away from the city's rain-soaked nights, Chloe stood on the manicured lawn of the university, a graduation gown flowing around her like a dark river. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming roses, filled with the joyful shouts of families and the triumphant click of cameras. She had done it. The degree, once a distant, desperate hope, was now a tangible reality clutched in her hand. She was no longer a ghost floating between tables, but a woman standing on the threshold of a life she had built for herself, brick by painful brick. The memories of that time, of him, had receded, becoming a quiet, foundational layer of her new strength, a story written in a language only she could understand. The past was a closed book, or so she had allowed herself to believe. Then she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the quad, partially obscured by the ancient stone archway that led back to the city. He was a stark figure of charcoal gray against the vibrant celebration, a shadow in the bright afternoon sun. He was alone, his hands in his pockets, his posture one of patient, absolute stillness. He was not looking at the stage or the crowd, but directly at her. The breath caught in her throat, a sudden, sharp intake of air. The noise of the celebration faded to a distant hum, and for a dizzying moment, she was back in that silent penthouse, the city lights glittering below. The old fear was air, a familiar ghost, but it was now tempered by a profound, heart-achingly sad recognition. He had come to witness the end of a story he could never be a part of. He had told himself it was a foolish risk, a sentimental indulgence his world did not permit, but he had to see it. He needed to witness this final, definitive proof that her light had not been extinguished by his darkness. From his vantage point, he watched her, not as the terrified girl in the ruined uniform, but as a woman poised and confident, her face radiant with a hard-won victory. This was the conclusion to the story of the honorable man he had failed so long ago. In her triumph, he found a sliver of vicarious redemption, a painful but necessary peace. He had not come to reclaim her or to reopen the wound. He was there to pay his respects, to see for himself that the world had not broken her, and then to disappear from her life forever, leaving her safe in the light. Their eyes locked across the expanse of green lawn, a silent, charged current flowing between them through the celebrating crowd. In that single, sustained gaze, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. She saw the man he was, stripped of his power and his violence, a solitary figure haunted by his own choices. His presence at her graduation, a final, desperate act of penance. He, in turn, saw that she understood. He saw no fear in her eyes, no lingering anger, only a deep, compassionate wisdom that acknowledged his sacrifice and absolved him. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a command or a dismissal. It was a concession, a farewell, a final, silent blessing that released them both from the ghosts of that rainy night. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then returned the nod, a small, graceful dip of her head that was both an acceptance and a goodbye. He turned without hesitation and walked away, his figure receding into the shadows of the archway until he was gone, swallowed once more by the city that was his kingdom and his prison. Chloe felt a single tear trace a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow, it was a release. The final chapter had been written. She turned back toward the sunlight, toward the sound of her mother calling her name, her future stretching before her, bright and clear. The weight she had carried for so long was finally lifted, leaving behind not an empty space, but a quiet, resilient strength. She would carry the memory of him, not as a wound, but as a secret testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of humanity can survive. He was the ghost in her story, the silent benefactor whose act of letting her go was the greatest gift he could ever give. His redemption was not in changing who he was, but in ensuring she could become who she was meant to be. This is a story about the light that finds its way through the cracks, a connection that defies worlds. If their journey moved you, if you believe in the hope of a second chance, please share this story, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more tales that explore the heart's most difficult choices. Some souls, after all, touch us for a moment but change us for a lifetime.